Hi, and welcome to Mid-South Viewpoint. I'm Byron Tyler. Bryan Loritts, lead pastor at Fellowship Memphis, has stopped by. Bryan, it's been a while.
Oh, Byron, it's been way too long, man.
You're busy writing books?
Yeah, I got a couple coming out and really excited about it. In fact, as soon as I leave you today, I've got a manuscript that was due last week that I've got to finish today. And but it's good stuff.
Hey, congratulations. 10 years Fellowship Memphis celebrates.
Oh, my gosh. It seems just like yesterday. We were unloading the moving truck at our home in East Memphis at the time, and now 10 years later, it's just been unbelievable.
3 campuses?
3 locations. That's exactly right. 1 downtown, 1 in East Memphis, and 1 out this way in Germantown.
It's always great to have the ministry of Fellowship Memphis on Bot Radio here locally. Yeah. Bridge for Life broadcast, been, I think, 7 years, the program's been on.
Yeah,
maybe going on 8 years.
Yeah, absolutely. You're good at this.
I produce the program.
Unbelievable. I run into people all the time who've been encouraged by the ministry, and that just warms my heart. So,
what is where you are today?
Yeah.
Is it where you thought you would be when you started 10 years ago?
I was just with a group of pastors earlier today. We were, just praying with one another, checking in with one another. And I just said, when it was my turn, Ephesians 3, when Paul says that God will do exceeding abundantly above and beyond anything you can ask or think. I mean, literally, I have experienced that specifically with this church. I had no preconceptions or ideas of what God would do. I thought I'd come. I knew God was calling me here. I figured, Byron, I'd be here for a little season to help these guys get this church going, to serve in whatever way I could, and then God would lead me elsewhere. But here I am 10 years later, from 26 people in a living room to there's probably a couple thousand that call us home, and God has blown our minds.
Wow. Well, preaching runs in the blood of the Loritts family, of course. Your dad, Crawford. I talked to your dad, I guess it's been a little over a year ago. He was at First Evangelical Church doing a Bible conference. Spoke to him for a little bit. And something that he said that was kind of neat, I thought, was as a little boy, he was about 14 years old, he shared the story growing up across New York, in New Jersey, I think.
Yep, Newark, New Jersey, and then he moved to Plainfield.
Okay. Well, when he was about 14, he said he remembers listening on the radio to Calvary Baptist Church, and the late Dr. Stephen Olford was pastor at the time. And he said he'd lay across his mom's bed and listen to the radio broadcast on Sunday night. He said he remembered saying, God, I just hope that one day I can preach like that.
Oh, yeah. The Olford family, I just told that story not too long ago to David. I had some time over there with what they're doing at the center there, and to encourage some leaders and some preachers over there. And Dr. Olford's ministry was a huge, huge encouraging impression on my dad and his ministry, which of course encouraged and impressed upon me greatly. So I would consider myself in a lot of ways a grandson of the ministry of Dr. Olford.
Well, today on our program, Bryan, we want to unpack, use that word a lot on your broadcast, a Greek term called Kainos.
Yes.
And there's a conference entitled 2014 Kainos. And you're organizing, putting together, and we've got some great stuff to tell our friends today.
Yeah, so, if you read Ephesians chapter 2, for example, when Paul, in that great passage, beginning in verse 11 through verse 22, he's really talking about what the death of Jesus Christ accomplished for us, and how it dismantled, as Paul would term, the dividing wall of hostility that had separated Jews from Gentiles. And now, because of what Christ accomplished, not only are we saved and reconciled to God individually, but now communally, we are placed in this thing called the body of Christ, where different ethnicities, different genders, different classes of people come together. So Paul says that Christ died to accomplish one new man. And the Greek word for new is the word kainos, which is a unique word. Typically, the word for new would be neos, which is something new as it relates in time, like the 2014 Ford Expedition or the brand new MacBook Pro. I mean, that's the idea of neos. Kainos is different. It doesn't speak of something new as it relates to time, but something new as it relates in kind. Really, the idea there is invention. It's something that the world had never seen before. So if Neos is the 2014 Ford Expedition, Kainos would be the Model T Ford. where that was a whole new paradigm. And so when he says Christ died to create one new man, the coming together of Jews and Gentiles in a segregated world like first century Rome, to see Jews and Gentiles worshiping together, loving each other, sharing meals together was not just something new as it relates to time. That was so drastically new that it was almost like an invention. And so we're calling it Kainos because it's time that the world sees the coming together, not just of Jews and Gentiles, but of blacks with whites, with Asians, with Latinos. And the need for this, Byron, this is kind of when I just come alive in my soul. The need for this is, when we talk about a multi-ethnic church, I mean, people just, they throw that around, multi-ethnic. What exactly does that mean? And sociologists have actually said there's a benchmark for it. It's the 80-20 rule, where if your church, if no one demographic makes up more than 80% of those who come, you qualify as being multi-ethnic. So if there's 100 people at your church and 80 of them are black and 19 of them or 81 are black, 19 or something else, you're not multi-ethnic. But if 80 or less is something and the rest kind of falls in that 20 percentage, then you would qualify as being multi-ethnic. Now, here's what's important. You take that 80-20 rule and you then ask, how many houses of worship would qualify as being multi-ethnic? And by that, I'm not just talking Christian. I'm talking Muslims, Buddhists, the whole nine. There's 300,000 worshiping communities that gather together every week. Of those 300,000, only 7.5% would qualify as being multi-ethnic. If you then go, well, how many of those who name the name of Jesus Christ would qualify? Here's the disheartening stat. That stat actually drops from 7.5% to 2.5%. Our normal, Byron, is a homogeneous church. And what Kainos exists to do, it's an organization, it's a movement, it exists to establish a new normal that goes back to our first century roots. This is not kind of a new concept. The churches that Paul planted, for example, were primarily multi-ethnic. If you just kind of read the book of Acts, whenever Paul walks into a town, he's got two questions. Take me to the local synagogue. I want to preach Christ to the Jews. And then take me to where the Gentiles hang out. Acts 17, that's Mars Hill. Acts 19, when he's in Ephesus, that's the Hall of Tyrannus. He preaches Christ to Jews, preaches Christ to Gentiles, and then he doesn't start two churches. He starts one church and says, now that you've been reconciled to God, be reconciled to one another. So this isn't a cutting-edge new idea. It's as old as the church itself.
You talked about this. I was looking online at the address you gave up at Wheaton College at a recent conference, and you talked about the vertical reconciliation and the horizontal reconciliation. And we have to have, you said, straight the vertical understanding of reconciliation first before we can deal with the horizontal.
It's a both and, not an either or. And this is the most important thing. I shock people when I tell them, because people hear about our church, Fellowship Memphis, multi-ethnic church, so they figure I must talk about race a lot. I may have preached on race once in the last 2 or 3 years. We preach Jesus Christ. But we believe that a symptom of being reconciled to God through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ is that now I love people in general, and I pursue people of all walks of life, even people who don't look like, think like, act like, vote like me. So if I were to walk you through Ephesians 2, verses 1 through 10, I mean, we were dead in our trespasses and sin, and, we were walking to the course of this world. We love verse 4, but God being rich in mercy. Verses 8 and 9, we were saved by grace through faith and not of works, lest any man should boast. But it doesn't stop there. Now beginning in verse 11, horizontal, Jews and Gentiles. I think Ephesians 2, just the chronology of it, it's reconciled to God through Christ first. Yeah. I mean, Paul, when he writes the Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 15, that great resurrection chapter, he says what Christ has done for us through his resurrection, that's of first importance, right? So I got a problem with people who preach more horizontal reconciliation than vertical reconciliation. That's an idol. So we're not called to be sociologists, but an inclusive understanding of the gospel says it is absolutely incompatible for me to say I've been reconciled to God through Christ and yet don't do anything for the poor, don't do anything for people who look differently than me. So it's both and.
Describe the detriment, if you will, of social voluntary segregation, which I know is something that you despise.
Well, believe it or not, so our church hasn't solved that, right? I read something in my soul leaped when it says most multi-ethnic churches, the people who come there don't have multi-ethnic relationships. And I have found that to be true in many cases among many people at our church. So it's sort of like the Pro Bowl that just happened, where you've got all these people from different teams coming together for the big event. They play in the event, and then they go back to their own team afterwards. That's kind of like what many multi-ethnic churches are, where Sunday is kind of like the Pro Bowl event, where people from different teams, different tribes, different ways of life, they come there, they go to the event, but what we're trying to press down into our body is diverse dinner tables. A diverse auditorium isn't enough, but a diversity of dinner tables. And don't just hear diversity in ethnic terms, but think class as well, which is the biggest barrier to go. So it's been harmful and it's incompatible. And I got to tell you, there's just something even in my own heart. I tend to, birds of a feather flock together. I think that's the default of the fallen human heart, where I just kind of gravitate towards and limit myself only to people that I'm comfortable with, which are typically people who look like me. And we're missing out on a whole lot.
You know, I was looking at a PBS documentary recently on the abolitionists, and it was a couple-hour documentary, and I learned a whole lot, you know? I mean, taking time to really, as a matter of fact, I honestly sat there in tears thinking about how people could be so horrible to another people.
Yeah.
But then I started seeing these highlights where people were saying, "No, this is not right." You know, even though the church is saying this is okay, this is not God's will.
Absolutely.
And people that were my color skin coming to stand up for people of your color skin, and to the point they're willing to say, "I'm going to die for that right for them to be set free."
Absolutely. And I'm grateful to God for great abolitionists and people who had seats of power. We can go all the way back. They didn't use the term at the time, but that was really what William Wilberforce was, and a Jesus-loving white man who decided to steward his power in such a way that it was pointed towards the least of these. And because of his labors, my great-great-grandfather, who was a slave, was released and set free. And I know there's a lot of complexities and questions surrounding Abraham Lincoln and the genuineness of his heart or whatever, but praise God, he stewarded his position of power in such a way that the 13th Amendment was pushed through, it was ratified, and that did a lot of wonderful good. Even, you know, what people don't realize, there are a lot of people in the civil rights movement who marched with Dr. King or who wrote checks to fund events and to get people out of jail, the protesters who happened to be white. And so an inclusive narrative of the race discourse in our country, you know, we had a lot of white brothers and sisters who just did wonderful things and helped out, and which I'm grateful for.
But there's still a separation on Sunday morning, and as you talked about, you know, the church opening up to have fellowship with the brethren.
Right.
The brethren not being, you know, discriminatory, but we have a tendency, you know, still to have those prejudice, Brian.
Right.
I mean, how can we get past it? Is this conference? I mean, I know this is the first step, and I understand what you're wanting to do, but is this in reality gonna really change things?
Well, let me just say this couple things. Number one, I don't believe this might surprise you coming as one who pastors a multi-ethnic church. I don't think every church has to be multi-ethnic. I think God burdens a leader and a group of people with a passion for a specific community, and the priority of that church is to love and engage that community well. I mean, my goodness, if you plant a church in Bel Air, California, or North Dakota, chances are you're not going to be multi-ethnic, and that's okay. That's okay. But what I would push against is if you are in a community that is either multi-ethnic or is changing in that direction, and your people inside the church don't reflect the people outside the church in that immediate community, I do think you've got some hard questions and issues to wrestle with. What I want to give my life for, Byron, and this is one of those things, as my dad says, it makes me pound the table and weep. I want to give my life for my kids' generation and helping to establish a new normal so that Quentin, Miles, and Jaden, my 3 sons, they, after I'm long gone and they're moving into some town, setting up shop, trying to find the new dentist, the new doctor, now the new church, that something in them goes weird when they look at an all-something church, an all-black church, or an all-Hispanic church, or an all-white church, because they would have grown up in a normal of diversity. And so what Kainos fundamentally exists to do, it is to move the meter from 2.5% of all churches being multi-ethnic to now at least 50% of all churches being multi-ethnic. And so that's what this conference is about. During the day, if you are remotely interested in a church or an organization, I've even got business leaders coming who are saying we want to move our business, or we want to move our organization, or we want to move our church, or we want to plant a church that's going to move in a multi-ethnic trajectory. During the day, we're going to be at the National Civil Rights Museum. Beverly Robertson, great friend, has been very kind and generous to us. We've got people coming from California, from Texas, from all over the country who are leaders who are looking to get equipped by the leading experts in this field. Dr. Soong-Chan, who's written seminal books on it. Dr. George Yancey, who's the head of the sociology department at the University of North Texas, but who profoundly loves Jesus. Dr. John Perkins is going to be a part of that. Later on, Dr. John Piper and Dr. Tony Evans are going to be preaching together on the evening of Wednesday, April 16th at the Cannon Center. Already, we've got over 1,000 people signed up for the evening event. So I'm just telling you, you need to go to our website, kainos.is, K-A-I-N as in Nancy, O-S.is, to sign up. Maximum capacity is 2,000 people. You want to sign up for that. Already, we're not even 60 days out. We have over 100 people signed up for our day event that can only hold about 300 people. So if you want to get equipped by the best of the best, and here's what I love, Byron, I know I'm running my mouth here. What I love absolutely is that this is happening in the city of Memphis, in the very place in which Dr. King was assassinated, and I wanted it done here. I could have gone to New York, L.A., Chicago. I could have gone to more glamorous places, but I need this to happen in Memphis because selfishly, I want to see Memphis get a makeover and people stop taking that snapshot picture, Polaroid of us, dated April 4th, 1968. And so when we gather at the Cannon Center, thousands of us, blacks and whites, to hear one white man, John Piper, one black man, Tony Evans, talk about racial diversity and reconciliation and Christ-exalting diversity, man, that's going to be powerful for our city and helping us to turn the page.
Well, Bryan, prior to 10 years ago when you came to Memphis to begin Fellowship Memphis, you were in California, involved in a successful ministry there. Why Memphis?
We felt like, fundamentally, if we could come to one of the most segregated cities in the country, and God could use us to launch a successful, gospel-centered, disciple-making, multi-ethnic church, then that rips the rug out from any other excuse by any other person to do a multi-ethnic church. I mean, if we plant a multi-ethnic church in Miami or Dallas or New York or Chicago or L.A., people go, oh, of course. But now, Byron, I got to tell you, people literally scratch their heads when they hear multi-ethnic church in Memphis, and they go, my goodness, how did that happen?
Yeah.
And so we felt like we had to go to the toughest place to get it done, and by God's grace, that's what's happened.
The year 2050, we're going to see a big paradigm shift in our country. Yeah. Want to talk about that?
Yeah, in 2050, sociologists project for the first time in American history, we will be majority-minority. So our country is trending that way already. We're already seeing that happen in places like California and Texas. Already. If you even look at the biggest celebrities, they tend to be multi-ethnic, whether or not it's Halle Berry or The Rock in the acting sector, or if it's Tiger Woods in sports or Bruno Mars in music. I mean, literally the face of our country is changing, and that is a beautiful thing. See, I think we're being presented with an unprecedented opportunity. One of my staff guys asked me the question one time. He says, Bryan, if you could live any time in world history, when would it be? I said, as a black man, are you kidding me? Now. I mean, this is the most hopeful time. And so I believe unless the church really gets after Christ-exalting diversity, going back to our first century roots, we're going to miss a grand opportunity. Most of the people who come to our church from out of town, they move to Memphis and they Google diverse church. It's what they're hungering for. And so I think we've got a great opportunity that we need to really get after and seize.
I believe you said it's been a while, but you told me a story. It was in college, the first time you ever called the N-word.
Yeah, in college, it was unfortunate, and being called that by a white classmate being called that period is devastating. Couple that with a classmate in Bible college who names the name of Jesus Christ, even more devastating. And then adding fuel to the fire is I'm 19 years old at the time, Byron, and I'm dealing with my own sense of immaturities. And so I took that one isolated incident and I just kind of branded a whole group of people as being not worthy of my trust. And bitterness just kind of crept into my soul, to be quite honest with you. And I harbored deep-seated racism. Somebody asked me once, well, how'd you get into multi-ethnic ministry? One word, pain. I think most people's passion is rooted to their pain. And, just like many social workers or psychologists or counselors get into it because of some traumatic experience they had or some lingering issue that they wrestle with, and they're trying to work it out on the fly. I found that to be true. Getting in multi-ethnic ministry has been incredibly redemptive to my own soul.
I was talking to our mayor, Memphis Mayor A.C. Wharton, a couple of weeks ago. He was talking about being the dream, and we were sharing some of the activities and things, surrounded by Dr. King's, anniversary.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Mayor Wharton said that kind of impressed me when he was talking about learning the lessons of suffering. Dr. King, writing from the Birmingham jail, was stabbed, of course. And he said he felt like he learned a whole lot more from his sufferings and what we need to learn about through suffering. And, the glory needs to be, capitalized and shouted and talked about. But there's some real lessons in suffering for all of us.
Especially, as a pastor, there's some broken experiences I've had to walk through personally, like anybody else. And what I've found, one of the residual benefits of that is it creates in you a deep-seated empathy for people who are walking through their own sense of brokenness. The Pulitzer Prize-winning author who wrote so prolifically in the early days of the AIDS epidemic back in the 80s was a guy named Jeffrey Schmaltz, I believe it was. And someone once asked him, how are you able to write so prolifically and emphatically and with such compassion for those who are suffering with AIDS? And in a very vulnerable moment, he goes, it's because I have AIDS. It's almost like one of those deals that just takes one to know one. And I don't care how much you study it, unless you've been through something, you're not going to be able to come alongside of others. So struggle is just it's just one of those things God uses.
And it's something we as the entire human race can identify with. There's no respecter of color.
Absolutely. People want to say, they want to act as if the hood is the only place that knows a broken marriage. And no, divorce is in cul-de-sacs and it's in projects. And, all walks of life, no struggle.
Yeah. Well, it's called Kainos, the 2014 conference, April 16th through the 17th. You've already mentioned a night with Dr. Tony Evans and Dr. John Piper on the that'll be at the Cannon Center on the 16th, the Wednesday. Is that correct?
Yeah, Byron, I would say this. It is absolutely critical that no one just goes, well, I'll just show up and come. You need to go to the website and register, even though for the evening event, we're not going to charge. Now, there's a registration fee for the day event. Another great thing about the day event is we're going to actually have an interview with Dr. John Piper and Dr. Tony Evans at 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Wednesday, April 16th. And so that's one of the great perks in being a part of the day event. That evening event, it's free, but because we're dealing with limited space that is already at 50% capacity, we need you to just go on the website, Kainos, Kainos.is, and let us know that you're coming. That way we're able to close it off when we reach capacity.
Of course, Dr. Tony Evans, I know a couple of years ago, he wrote the book, Oneness Embrace.
Absolutely.
I had the chance to interview him about that book when it came out. And, here's a man who's been through some suffering himself.
Yep.
And, God has given him a ministry of reconciliation. He's using him. Matter of fact, there was a time he couldn't even broadcast his sermons on the radio. Had a very difficult time finding because radio stations were very segregated and looking for particular programming to put together. But there was a man, Dr. James Dobson, who came along his side and helped him to launch, his radio. I mean, wrote letters, put his neck out, for him to say, hey, here is someone that is worthy, of our time and your airtime.
Absolutely. Well, honestly, I think the penultimate example of what you're talking about, as far as someone who went through a lot, but refused to get bitter, and is one of the most loving, joyful people I know. It's Dr. John Perkins. I mean, here's a guy in Jackson, Mississippi, was beaten up by the KKK, went through horrific experiences as he was one of the guys in the front lines of the civil rights movement. And yet you talk about a person who made up in his mind, I'm not going to get bitter, I'm not going to get angry, I'm going to love. I don't know of a more loving individual than Dr. John Perkins. I'm blessed that he's part of our conference.
I met Dr. Perkins back in the early '80s, back in Jackson, Mississippi. I was at the Reformed Seminary. I was at a conference there, and I would have not known because of the humility and just the genuine love and the time we shared was just wonderful. But a great lineup of people who've been there. And this was, when you were thinking about, did you already just automatically think these men would be the ones you'd want to come? Or
Yeah, I just swung for the fences. I just came up with a list of people, and I just figured, I'll do well if, 2 or 3 of them tell me yes. And lo and behold, as I just kind of picked up the phone, made phone calls, cast the vision for it, one by one, they all said yes. And then I was like, shoot, how am I going to pay for this? So, but it's been a God thing, and I'm deeply encouraged.
I'd like for you, as we wrap up our program, you gave an illustration when you addressed the group at Wheaton College recently, and I think it's a great wrap-up here. It was you traveling from London, and then you traveled to Australia.
Yeah, sure.
Can you share that?
Yeah, so one of my favorite things to do in life is to take my wife out of the country. And in fact, she's got a milestone birthday coming up that I won't mention what year it is because she would not like that. But I'm going to take her to her favorite city, London, which we've been to before. And not too long after going to London, I got invited to give a series of messages down in Australia, and I took my bride with me. And so we get down to Australia, which of course is thousands upon thousands of miles away from London. But you get there and you have the impression that you are in the UK, which is thousands upon thousands of miles away. You get there and they drive down the left side of the road in Australia, just like they do back in London. At 10 o'clock in the morning and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they break for tea in Australia, just like they do thousands upon thousands of miles away in London. I remember watching a group of men, they happen to be Aborigines, playing cricket. Which is this unique game down in Australia, just like they do tens of thousands of miles away in London. And for all practical purposes, being in Australia, you thought you were back in London. And you just kind of beg the question, how did this happen? And the way it happened is some years ago, a group of people boarded boats in London, sailed to this way far away country, and they took the culture of London and injected it into this new place called Australia, so much so that Australia looked just like the faraway place called England. And really, that's what the kingdom, the body of Christ, is supposed to be. We exist fundamentally to take the culture, practices, and customs of a faraway place called heaven, inject it into this new place called earth, so that earth looks just like heaven.
Wow. We long for that.
Yep.
Pray for that.
Yep.
Okay, it's the Kainos 2014.
Yes.
The website is the best stop for folks to go to. What's the address again?
Kainos, K-A-I-N as in Nancy, O-S.is. And you can find out more about the event, find out some resources that will help your thinking here. Again, if you're a part of an organization, a business, a church, looking to plant a church, that you're going, I want to move this thing in a multi-ethnic trajectory, this is the best thing happening in our country. All
right, I'm looking forward to hearing more about this. And don't forget, friends, you can also listen to Bryan each week, Sunday morning here on Bott Radio Network, AM 640 and FM 100.7, 7:30 in the morning, very early. But on your way, as you're getting ready to attend worship, you can tune in to Bridge for Life.
Yes.
Hope they'll do that.
Yes. Thanks for the partnership. We've loved being a part.
Bryan Loritts, God bless you, my friend. Thank you for what you're doing for Christ's kingdom and sharing with Bot Radio today.
Thanks, Byron. Always a pleasure.
Friends, that's all the time we have on this edition of Mid-South Viewpoint. Thanks for stopping by. I'm Byron Tyler. We'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.